Welcome to Let the Boys Kiss, the creation of queer ships, where we ask the question, is it queer baiting, queer coding, or queer canon?
This week we'll be discussing John and Sherlock from BBC's Sherlock. I'm Maddie.
And I'm Kelsey. Oh my god, we're back again.
Sorry, folks, we are in a Backstreet Boys state of mind today.
Yes, we have been singing leading in, and we're just a little concerned it's going to keep coming up, so we're just going to go with it.
Prepare for that. So we're back again, and we're talking about Johnlock, or John Watson, and Sherlock Holmes from the BBC version of Sherlock, though they do exist in basically all other versions of Sherlock Holmes media.
You and I have both seen all of BBC's Sherlock.
Though you have seen it more recently than I, so if there are details to be remembered, that's going to be on you, buddy.
Yes, so I had originally only watched the first 2 seasons of Sherlock, but when we decided to do this one for the pod, I was like, I guess I gotta watch those second 2 seasons. And I did it. Mm-hmm. So we're ready to go.
So I guess, as we usually do, we should say, like, generally, how do you feel about, in this case, both Sherlock the show and Sherlock the concept?
So it's interesting because, again, thinking about this in preparation, I realized I don't think I've ever seen like a classic, traditional, straight adaptation of a Sherlock Holmes story, nor have I read the books.
Yeah, I haven't read them either. That does bring to my mind the question of if I've ever seen a straight adaptation. I've seen, I've seen a lot of Elementary on CBS. I've seen maybe only the first of the Robert Downey Jr. movies. I can never remember.
I've seen both of those. And I've seen, obviously, a bunch of stuff that references Sherlock Holmes heavily.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get away from it.
So I think the closest, and I guess this is probably technically a pretty straight adaptation, I think they did 2 Wishbone episodes of Sherlock Holmes stories, and I saw both of those as a child.
So that's probably the most, like, traditional
adaptation. Yeah, like one-to-one adaptation of the story. So I think what that ends up meaning, though, is neither of us are probably particularly precious about the character of Sherlock Holmes.
This is the type of thing, like, we've talked before about the types of media where people are very precious about the adaptation, or maybe there's no adaptation at all. Like, if you're thinking about Star Wars and the only version of it that's ever existed is these films, and people have this idea about exactly what they are. This, I think, is the flip side of that coin, where it's been adapted hundreds of times into every kind of media you can imagine. If there are Sherlock, like, purists out there, I don't really know who they are and what their idea is about this, because it's just been done so many times. It's basically like a fable or something at this point. Like, everyone has done their version of it.
Yeah, and I've never watched an adaptation of Sherlock Holmes and been like, this isn't true to the character of
exactly, because who is the character at this point?
It's the guy. I guess if I watched an adaptation, quote unquote, of Sherlock Holmes, and he didn't solve any crimes and was like a taxi driver who just, like, I'd be like, this is weird.
Why? Yeah, you'd be like, why are we calling him Sherlock Holmes? I'm not really understanding.
But I don't know. I wouldn't be upset about it. I'd just be like, interesting choices.
Exactly. So yeah, that's, I think, where we are in terms of our opinions about Sherlock Holmes.
Were you a fan of BBC's particular adaptation?
I was for a while. The first couple seasons I was into. Up to the 3rd season, I think I was still enjoying it. 4th season got fully kind of off the rails for me. And then I think really what ended up happening with Sherlock is the stuff outside of the show ended up taking over the conversation about the show. And so I just sort of, plus there's the fact that it's BBC and it takes years for the seasons to come out. It just sort of like fell off of my radar, I think. How about you?
So I was trying to figure out actually why I had initially stopped watching after the first 2 seasons, which it could have just been incidental, like I just stopped watching. But I realized what happened was season 2 aired at the beginning of 2012. Season 3 aired in 2014, and in between, Star Trek Into Darkness came out, as did the Hobbit adaptation.
And you got mad at Benedict Cumberbatch and
Martin Freeman. And I was like, I don't need to look at these actors anymore, maybe ever again. So I watching the show anymore.
Well, that's why actors need to be careful about their choices, you know?
Yes, they'll lose a viewer. So,
This is it. You've lost a viewer.
um, so yeah, and I'll be honest, now going back and watching the second half, I don't feel like if I'd never seen it, it would have been like a great
It wouldn't have
tragedy.
changed your life, no. But you wouldn't have been able to do this episode of our
It's
podcast.
true. So that's where we are.
So let's start with our usual, why are people shipping these characters? Why are we talking about them? And we'll start with just a little bit of the canon evidence, as
Right.
it were.
So right out of the gate,
Episode 1.
people are constantly asking if they are a couple. So the show puts this idea front and center in a lot of
Yes.
when John initially goes to look at Sherlock's apartment, Mrs. Hudson is like, "Oh, will you be needing? We have an upstairs bedroom as well. I don't know if you'll be needing it."
Right. And then in the same episode, after they solve the case, I think it's
mid case.
Mid case.
Mm-hmm.
Sherlock takes John to a favorite restaurant of his where he's a pal of the owner, and the owner assumes that the two of them are there on a date, and it's this whole running thing of John having to constantly say, like, we're not on a date. And then while they're on this not date, John ends up asking Sherlock if he has a girlfriend, and Sherlock says he's not really into that. And then he asks if he has a boyfriend, and very clearly is like, which is fine. And Sherlock's like, I know it's fine, but I'm married to my work, is how he leaves it.
Gives different answers to those two questions.
Yeah, not into women, doesn't have a boyfriend because he's married to his work.
So those are very early on, but just throughout the show, people are constantly, I guess, mistaking them for a couple or thinking they're a couple, and it's always quote unquote no homoed away by I would say even John in particular.
Oh, and even when they're not being accused of being a couple, when they're just alone in a scene together and they do something like that challenges John's heterosexuality in some way, like there's a scene where they're running away from danger or something and they grab each other's hands to run, and John is like, I hope no one sees this or they'll think we're gay. And you're like, okay, who is that for, John? Who are you talking to? And then in the scene when the scene at the pool when Moriarty has captured John and Sherlock ends up saving him, as Sherlock is trying to, take off he's like strapped with a bomb or something. He's taking it off, and John, again, for no one, because they're the only ones there, says, good thing no one's seeing this, you taking my clothes off in a darkened pool. And you're just sort of like, what's your deal, John? Why are you so preoccupied with this?
It's really excessive.
And like, I guess clearly meant to be played for humor, but there gets to be a certain point where it's like, is it that funny to say we're not gay? Is that a joke even? Like,
right.
What are you trying to do here? And why does it keep happening over and over? Mark Gatiss will speak to that a little bit in a quote we talk about later, but I still think it's a bit much.
I agree. Another piece of evidence we have, right, is the scene with Irene Adler when John and Irene are talking about Sherlock, and I guess she says, oh, you're in love with him? And he's like, I'm not.
Yeah, she calls them boyfriends or something.
Yeah. And he says, I'm not gay. And she says, I am. And look at us both.
Yeah, as in like you and me, both people who are generally attracted to women, yet here we are in love with Sherlock Holmes.
Now, the other thing that the show does that's really interesting to me, and I guess we'll probably talk about this more, is season 3 and 4 are I think, really different from season 1 and 2. And we've talked in previous episodes about how one of the functions of fan fiction is to shift a story away from just being plot-based to being very character-driven. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, season 3 and 4 do that. To season 1 and 2.
Yeah, kind of. Compared to season 1 and 2. Season 1 and 2 are, I mean, I don't know enough about the Sherlock Holmes canon to know like how closely they're sticking to the stories, but it feels like seasons 1 and 2 are, each episode is very much like one of the mysteries, and the episode is all about adapting the story to the show, and there's like little bits of character here and there, but they're plot driven. It's a detective show, you know? And then when you get to season 3, what happens?
It just becomes all about Sherlock and John and their relationship and John's feelings about Sherlock faking his death in the first episode in season 3.
Sherlock's feelings about John having a fiance, then wife.
Right. The whole second episode, the wedding episode, is barely about a mystery.
I mean, yeah, they talk about, he weaves in mysteries to it, but the plot of the episode is not the mysteries. The plot of the episode is John's getting married and Sherlock is upset about it, basically.
And I think kind of furthering that is in season 3 and 4, almost all of the mysteries are somehow directly tied to Sherlock or John or Mary or someone in their life. They're not just, there was a crime in town and we have to go out and solve this crime. It's a really interesting shift.
Yeah, noticeable. We'll get into probably more details going forward, but that's probably enough to lay the groundwork for why this is the shit people talk about.
So there's clearly a good amount in the canon of the show. Not only does it exist, it's directly commented upon frequently through the no homoing of
constant no homoing. Very much a lady doth protest too much sort of situation.
But I guess outside of the show, right, what are the creators saying? How are they justifying all of this hand-holding that they're putting into the show?
I would say they're not justifying the hand-holding at all. They are actively telling you the hand-holding is meaningless. Why are you asking us about the hand-holding? So we'll start, I guess, with the actors, as we like to do. We'll start with Martin Freeman. I think before I tell you what Martin Freeman has said, so that we can give him the fairest of shakes possible, we should mention that the actress that plays his wife later in the show in season 3, Mary, and in season 4, is played by his real life wife from the time. I think they're divorced now. And due to circumstances outside of the show that we will be talking about in greater depth later, there was some vitriol pointed at this actress by a lot of fans, and to the point where she was like getting death threats in the way that, happens to female actresses because people on the internet are not fucking cool. So there was this air of tension, I think, around those seasons of the show, his experience with the show, and particularly his experience with fans. We'll call them fans, even though that sort of aggression really has no place in fandom. But I think he was soured a bit on the experience with the fans, and so has said some less than friendly things about the Johnlock shippers out there. So I will start with this quote from the Telegraph, which kind of tickles me, actually. He says, quote, "There was a chunk of people who just knew it was going to end with us getting together," us being John and Sherlock. "Me and Ben, we have literally never played a moment like lovers. We ain't fucking lovers." He really wants it to be clear for folks who might be confused out there.
Yeah.
And then also, there was a point, this must have been between seasons 3 and 4, maybe even around season 4 time. He talks about how the experience of doing the show has become, quote, "not fun anymore." Saying, if you're in something that has a lot of fans, that's better than being in something that has no fans. My point with Sherlock was that those expectations can be heavy.
Yeah. So he struggled, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah. When the relationship between the fans and the creators gets adversarial, kind of aggressive, threatening, violent, that could be tough to deal with. That said, he was not diplomatic about people who are shipping Johnlock. So where does Benedict Cumberbatch come out?
Benedict Cumberbatch had a bit of a different perspective, although, again, to our knowledge, he did not have anyone close to him receiving death threats, so a little different experience. He said about, I guess, the fans specifically, it's the responsibility of the storytellers to manage that, really. And I think, it's pretty weak to blame that on fans. You're either along for the ride or not. And I think to be kowtowing would, in some cases, disappoint fans. So I don't think it can all rest on that. I think there are more people responsible than the people receiving what you're working on.
Yeah, I think this was in response to one of those Martin quotes that people perceive to be,
anti-fan
about the fans, anti-fan. And Benedict was like, well, let's not be anti-fan. Though again, not in the same situation as Martin emotionally. So at first you're sort of like, well, maybe Benedict is very like chill about the Johnlock shippers and the fandom in general, kind of a live and let live sort of man. But then we stumbled upon some interesting opinions he had about fandom and fan fiction in general.
I like even how the intro to this quote is written, so I'm going to read that. Cumberbatch is referring to the rapacious slash fiction community that has turned his chilly, acerbic, and question mark distinctly asexual, we'll get back to that, Sherlock into a lustful cock monster.
Yeah, I think the interviewer here has their own opinion about fandom that they have potentially led Benedict into commenting on as well. But what did Benedict have to say about that?
But what he says is, it's always like one of them is tired, one comes back from work, the other is horny, a lump appears in his trousers, and then they're at it. It's usually me getting it. I'm biting Watson's dog tags. Then the interviewer says, like, perhaps making Holmes and Watson gay is a way to remove other women from the picture. And Benedict Cumberbatch says, yes, yes. I think it's about burgeoning sexuality in adolescence because you don't necessarily know how to operate that. And I think it's a way of neutralizing the threat. So this person is sort of removed from them as somebody who could break their heart.
So there's a lot going on here
Yeah.
with this quote. I would like to address many parts of it. I would like to address the interviewer who has laid this label onto Sherlock of being distinctly asexual, which we'll get more into later because I don't think the creators would agree with him there. And then we've got Benedict, who, bless him, clearly does not have a lot of experience with fan fiction and has, what interestingly, it's not in this quote, but we did find other quotes where clearly someone has showed him a particular fan fiction that involves John and Sherlock like in space or something. Yes. And he keeps talking about it. He brings it up in every interview where someone mentions fan fiction to him. It scarred him for life. But I just wish people who didn't really know anything about a community of people would refrain from talking about it instead of laying out a bunch of ill-formed opinions, because they get into a lot of assumptions here. They're assuming that all of the people writing these fan fictions are like seemingly teenage girls, right? That seems to be the implication, who are like in love with the men that they're writing about, and therefore, this is the implication, make them gay so that there is not the threat of another woman gaining their affection.
Right.
That seems to be what they're saying.
Somehow that would make them less attainable, more attainable. If they're gay, they're more attainable than if they have a girlfriend.
I guess it's kind of like a, well, if I can't have them, then no one should sort of situation.
Okay.
I don't know. They're saying a lot that's somewhat offensive. Really, what offends me more is this like low level homophobia going through the whole thing. Him talking about how his character's getting it and biting Watson's dog tags. You're just sort of like, why are you talking like this?
So I think the conclusion we drew from where the actors stand is Martin's pretty angry and Benedict's out of touch.
Yes, kind of out of touch. He does seem to speak from a position of like, when he talks about the fandom, it's like he doesn't interact with them a lot, seemingly. He seems like someone who maybe like doesn't really have social media, doesn't have to hear a lot from fans other than maybe at conventions, and therefore, unlike Martin, is able to speak from a position of like, who cares? But then also, I have weird opinions about fan fiction and I'd like to share them.
So our actors not doing too much, really. Where we really get into the interaction or potential conflict between the fans and creators are our creators, our writers, our showrunners.
And our creators have a lot to say about this ship in particular.
Oh boy, they do. So Moffat and Gaddis.
Yeah, or Moftis, as people sometimes call them. Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss. I think it's Gatiss?
I'm not
Could
sure.
be Gaddis. I don't know.
Look it up.
The two of them are the writers and have been asked many, 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 many times. This is not a situation where they don't have a lot to say about it because they get confronted with Johnlock questions all the time. So let's start with Stephen Moffat, who in an interview with The Guardian in 2012, so this would be back in season 2 times, pre-season 3, when things get really Johnlock heavy in the canon, says that he wanted to keep Sherlock's celibacy as it was in the source material, as both of us have never read the source material. I guess that's a part of it, that Sherlock is celibate.
Sure.
Explaining that there's no indication in Conan Doyle's stories that he was, quote, asexual or gay, and even said he, quote, declines the attention of women because he doesn't want the distraction. Moffat went on to explain that Sherlock wouldn't live with a man if he, quote, thought men were interesting, and it was, quote, the choice of a monk, not the choice of an asexual. So, I kind of feel like almost any time creators get into mentioning asexuality, they're doing it in a less than good way. So,
with the exception, right, of Neil Gaiman.
Yes, Neil Gaiman stands alone at this point. So, what's Moffat doing here? He's saying a lot of things. He's saying Sherlock is celibate. That's a fact from the Conan Doyle stories. So, we need to come up with our reason for why that is. And he wants you to know it's not that he's asexual. He's celibate by choice. And he chooses to be celibate because having some sort of human sexual interaction would be a distraction from the purity of his detective work. And then further goes on to say that the fact that he invites John to come live with him is like proof of this, because if he were proof that he's not gay, at least, because if he were, inviting a man to come live with him would be way too much distraction. So he would never do that. So again, this is the, quote, choice of a monk, not the choice of an asexual. Though, again, not sure where that comes into it at all, because an asexual could choose to live with a man or a woman, right? Like, what would that have to do with anything? I don't really understand.
I guess he's just getting at he's definitely celibate, not asexual.
A lot going on there, but
yeah.
we will leave it at that for Moffat, I guess. Although he does the same thing as Gatiss, which you'll see later, where people say, are Johnlock getting together? And they are unequivocal in stating, no, they're not. They're never getting together. It's not going to happen. Stop asking us, is the vibe of all of their interviews. So let's go on to Mark. This is in 2014. So this is either like right before or at the time of season 3 happening. So someone asks him at a Comic-Con, did you at any point have to resist the temptation of Sherlock and Watson being gay? What a fun little question. And he says, well, in response to that, he was like, it wasn't a temptation. But we jump ahead in his quote here. And he says, this is where we're going to get to something we talked about earlier. The whole idea of John and Sherlock being mistaken for a couple in our show is inspired by the Billy Wilder film, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which we love to distraction, the we here being him and Moffat.
Yes, and we have never seen it, Maddie and I.
Right, we are not the ones that love it to distraction. Stephen and Mark are the ones. And in that, Sherlock gets out of an awkward situation by claiming that he and Watson are a couple, so we sort of run with the same joke. But it's a joke. That's obviously not to belittle the idea that they could be, but in our version, they are not. And Sherlock specifically says in episode 1, when John asks him if he has a girlfriend or a boyfriend, he says, no, all that matters to me is brain work. Everything else is just transport. His body is an appendage to him. Now, I'll stop there and say all that last part he didn't say, actually, in the episode.
As we discussed, that's not what he said.
Not what he said. What he said was, not interested in women, don't have a boyfriend because I'm married to my work.
Yes. But also, right, this goes back to the no homo of it all, of like, it's not a funny joke.
Right. So he's saying here, the fact that we constantly have people mistake them for a couple and have them comment on the fact that they're not a couple is meant to be a running joke as a reference to this Billy Wilder film, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Now, I can take him at his word there, I suppose, but I quibble with the argument that it's a funny running joke. It doesn't seem very funny to me. Even in the first episode, it's not that funny, but then once you've done it over and over again, it's sort of like, what's the joke?
Why does this keep happening? It's weird.
It's weird.
The amount at which it happens is weird.
Why do they keep talking about it? Who's it a joke for? When you boil it down, what's the joke? The joke is the idea that these two men could be in a relationship? Why is that a joke? I don't understand it at all. Now, we shouldn't lay too much like homophobic intention on Mark Gatiss since he is a gay man. But that said, I don't know about that as a running joke, and I don't really understand it. I would think a reference to that movie one time might be funny.
Again, we haven't seen the movie, so I don't know what the awkward situation is that they get out of. But I suppose you could write into your episode a clear reference where it's a similar awkward situation.
Now, again, we can't speak to it because we haven't seen it, though. What we'll get into later, people who are Johnlock conspiracists use actually this film and the fact that these guys are a fan of it as evidence that the two of them are together, because I guess there's like an idea that the movie has serious queer subtext, not just like a joke one time about how they might have been together. So I don't know how much weight to give that, but there is another side where I think some people who are fans of that movie see it differently than Gatiss does.
Sure.
So then we'll get to the next part of this quote from him is, if we had an agenda of making Sherlock and Dr. Watson an openly gay couple, love that he calls it an agenda, that's what we would have done. But that's not what we're doing. That's not what we're doing. I'm very happy everybody thinks what they like, but it's never going to happen. And in this write-up of the quote, because it's from Comic-Con, they write in that the crowd complains when he says this. And he goes on, no, I'm not joking. It's not. The point of the series is not to make them an openly gay couple. And as I said, the danger is, people say, but why? They should be, because we need more openly gay couples in television. Yes, we do, but this is our show, and we're just making a decision about our characters. I'd be very happy to write another show in which there's an openly gay couple, and that's what it's about. But it's not this one.
Yeah. So again, right, there's a couple of problems here. One, like that's the crux of the problem with representation. Everyone is someone's show. So whose responsibility is it to create representation? Sort of everyone's.
Yeah,
right?
You would think.
So I don't know if I particularly like that as an answer. But I think we've talked about this in other instances, right? There's a line you can walk either way of like, you can have a gay couple, right? And the show doesn't have to be about that.
Yeah, that's one of my main quibbles with his quote here is him saying, I'd be happy to write another show where there's an openly gay couple, and that's what it's about. That to me raises some alarm bells, because I think there's an idea, even apparently among gay television writers, that when you make your characters gay, that's what the show is about. And I don't know that that needs to be the case, really.
But it's also odd, right? Because, again, if this is right around the premiere of season 3, there is a distinct shift to the show being about John and Sherlock's personal lives and their relationships. So at the same time, it's like, what are they trying to accomplish with that shift in focus?
Yeah, because the show, if your show stayed straight procedural the whole way through, right?
Yes.
Again, I would argue that, like, that doesn't have any bearing on whether or not your characters are straight or gay.
Sure.
But at least you could say, like, everyone needs to stop focusing so much on the sexual identities and personal lives of these characters. They're meaningless and have nothing to do with the show. The show is about the cases.
Yes.
But that's not at all the case with late seasons of this show. The show is not about the cases. The show is about the characters and their development and what's going on with them emotionally. And so you're making a show about character development and explicitly choosing not to make them queer, even though you're constantly having them comment on the fact that people think that they're gay. So it's like, what are all of these things doing together, right? Like, all of the different pieces of the writing are coming together in this interesting way that doesn't necessarily seem to mesh with the way that the writers talk about the show.
Right. You asked me as we were outlining, like, what is the arc of Sherlock? What are they trying to accomplish with the show? And I was like, I don't really know. I don't know that anything, like, comes together in a way where I'm like, I get what they were attempting to do and the overarching story they were attempting to tell. Which, again, if it's a procedural, is not a question I have. I don't usually watch procedurals and say, you know, like,
what's the emotional arc for these characters, right?
And so, yeah, if it just stuck to being a procedural, you'd be like, fine. But the shift to it being about John and Sherlock and so much emphasis on whether they're gay or not is weird if you as the writer are like, this isn't what the show is about. This isn't what we're doing. Then don't write in everyone thinking they're gay and it just being about their relationship and
Exactly.
Make the show
Like,
a
you
procedural.
can't on the one side write a show with so much explicit queer subtext that feels like it's there for a reason, because you're both commenting on it out loud in the show, right? Over and over, you're having them mention the idea that they might be gay, that people think they're gay, that they're sick proclaiming that they're not gay, but acting in a way that makes people think they are anyway. Even the Irene Adler thing, where she basically is like, yeah, we're both into women, but we're obviously in love with Sherlock. Like, that's the text of the show, not even the subtext of the show. So you're writing that, and then you're also in all of your interviews that people ask you about, so like, what's going on with John and Sherlock? You're like, why do people keep asking me that? They're not going to be gay. They're not gay. We're not writing that. That's not the show we're writing. This is our show, and it's about straight guys. So that's its own weirdness. So yeah, they're kind of dicks from these quotes, from the way that they interact with their fans. They're very dismissive. But in addition to being assholes towards the fans, they're also known liars and
Yeah.
admitted about themselves. So Stephen Gaddis. This is what happens when you call yourselves Moftis. I'm going to start to.
Just are you referring to one of them, or do you want to just call them Moftis?
I'm referring to Stephen Moffat, because I was going to say he also is a Doctor Who writer, and over in that fandom is also known for doing this thing where they like explicitly try to mislead fans about what's going to happen on the show. And they're known for saying one thing's going to happen and then it's not what happens, or saying one thing's not going to happen and then it is what happens. They, instead of what would be my strategy, I think, if I were running a show, of just not answering questions about the upcoming plot, they seem to take great pleasure in misleading people. So as an example of that, in 2012, after the second season, which ends with seemingly Sherlock dying, obviously there are 2 more seasons, so he's not actually dead, spoiler alert.
Right, and we do see at the end of the second season episode that he's still alive. So we know from within the show that he faked his death. Right. But so how did he do
then
it?
Then Moffat claimed in 2012, there's a clue everybody's missed. So many people theorizing about Sherlock's death online, and they missed it. We've worked out how Sherlock survives and actually shot part of what really happened. It all makes sense. Now tell me, Kelsey, when they come back for season 3, how did he do it?
Don't know. I don't.
They literally don't tell you.
There are several explanations given, and we'll talk a little bit more about season 3, episode 1 later as well. But yeah, nothing definitive is said, and clearly they didn't figure it out.
No, or they did and decided it wasn't important to tell the story. Hard to say, but he's taking great pleasure here in saying, like, we're so clever, no one can guess what we're writing. The show is impenetrable because we're just such amazing writers, and nobody's caught the clue we put in. And then in 2016, right before the 4th season airs, Mark Gatiss says, we've explicitly said this is not going to happen. There's no game plan, no matter how much we lie about other things, that this show is going to culminate in Martin and Benedict going off into the sunset together. We're not trying to fuck with people's heads, not trying to insult anybody or make any kind of issue about it. There's nothing there.
And it's, if you admit you're a liar, why would I believe you? Again, when in the show, you've written so much evidence that they could be a couple.
Yes. So, okay, this is the backdrop against which all of this is happening, right? The fans are becoming more and more convinced that Johnlock is, at the very least, being hinted at by the writers, right? The writers are becoming more and more adamant that it's not. We're not implying that. We never meant for it to happen. So in this, stew, this stew of things happening, emerge a couple of different reactions among the fandom and just, like, I guess, like, media critics in general, people who have opinions about the show. There was a growing group of people claiming that the show was queer baiting, and at this point, like, pretty aggressively queer baiting, because of all of the intense references in the show to them being queer but not queer. And then as you get specifically into season 3, how much the show is about their relationship and, like, the implication of them being in a relationship, or at least having feelings for each other. So there's, like, growing calls for the show to address their queer baiting issues.
And another example of the queer baiting that's going on in the show, and we couldn't really figure out where to slot this in elsewhere in the episode is Moriarty.
Yes. The lovely Andrew Scott, who really puts in like a performance.
And so obviously not as much of a focus,
Mhm.
but he is a clearly queer coded character.
Yes. So that's its own issue of queer-coded villains and that whole history. But
Right.
I was saying to Kelsey when we were outlining, like, if somehow this show existed, but John was just gone. So it's a show about like Sherlock, the lone detective who has no friends and lives by himself, and like the only other character is his brother or something. And Moriarty was exactly the same, and everything that happens with Moriarty and Sherlock stays the same. I think this would be a conversation about the Moriarty Sherlock queer baiting, right? Because there are
Yes.
the sort of there's chemistry, there's implications, there's the same sort of, if not as many of them, the same sort of references to like an attraction between the two of them.
So even more going on.
Even more going on. So we've got that. We've got a whole segment of the fandom increasingly saying like, can you guys stop writing the show like this if you have no intention of having the two of them get together, because it's getting a little offensive at this point. And then we have what is one of the more interesting fandom events in recent years. We have a segment of the fandom that decides like, we love this show, these writers are great, we think that they're good writers, we trust them with these characters, and they're telling us all of these things in the show about the characters and their feelings for each other, and they keep referencing the fact that they're like maybe queer but not queer. So something's going on here, and if that something is not queer baiting, and I don't want it to be queer baiting because
And the writers are known liars
yeah,
who are telling me it's not happening, but they're liars.
so they decide they're lying about not lying, I guess, and they do intend for the two of them to get together in the end of the show. So out of this soup develops something called the Johnlock conspiracy. And I think it emerges right after the second episode of season 3, which is the wedding episode, which is, when you watch it, it's kind of striking how much that episode is all of a sudden about their feelings for each other, particularly like, even if you don't think that the episode is implying that they're in love with each other, I feel like the episode is at least implying that Sherlock is in love with John. Like, the entire plot of it is John's getting married, Sherlock is devastated. And so you're like, what's the subtext of that, right? It feels pretty clear. Maybe it is that, like, he's sad that he's losing his platonic friend, but that feels like a little bit more of a leap than what you would assume from this situation. Because if you were getting married, I wouldn't act like Sherlock. I hate to tell you.
It's okay.
So yeah, so the Johnlock conspiracy, I will give you the definition from fan lore just so you can get like the vibe of what this is. The Johnlock conspiracy is a fan theory which asserts that the writers of BBC Sherlock intend to make John Sherlock the canon endgame pairing. The theory is often presented as a rebuttal to the allegations of queerbaiting commonly lodged against the show by other fans and in the mainstream media. So what are the effects of this?
So, right, the unfortunate effects is it ends up being pretty divisive within the fandom.
Yes.
Of course, the Johnlock conspiracy folks are convinced that Johnlock is endgame.
Yes.
And it sort of starts like a fan civil war around what's happening with the show and what are the writers' intent, and are you a real fan, or
who gets to call themselves a real fan of the show? They start to call people who ship Johnlock but don't believe in the conspiracy antis. There's like all sorts of othering language going on, and it becomes a thing where it's hard for people to exist in these fandom spaces together in ways that don't lead to conflict. So I think there's kind of like a schism in the fandom at this period, and a lot of people who are turned off by it end up kind of driven out of at least the online fandom spaces. And then it also, unfortunately, contributes to what we were talking about earlier, the sort of like threats of violence against the poor actress who plays Mary, and that it like exacerbates the tensions that are already there between the creators and the fans.
And I think one of the more interesting components of the Johnlock conspiracy is what happens after the season finale.
Yeah, this gets fascinating.
And John and Sherlock are not endgame.
Yeah, so the show, the conspiracy comes about in season 3 when things all of a sudden are about John and Sherlock and the wedding happens and all of that. So the fans of this decide, like, in season 4, since it's supposed to be the final season, that's when it's going to happen. We're going to be endgame. They have to make the reveal that the two of them are together in season 4. Otherwise, like, when are they going to do it?
Oh, and the thing is too, right? I forget which episode it's in. It's the one where Sherlock has gotten arrested for killing that Danish or Dutch guy.
Yeah.
They're at the airport together, so he's about to be flown off, and he does that thing where he's like, "There's something I have to tell you."
Yeah, something I've always meant to tell you, John. And John's like, what? And there's this pause, and then Sherlock's like, Sherlock's actually a girl's name, and you're like, ha 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 ha. So yeah, they're convinced it's gonna happen in season 4. Season 4 airs. It's its own kind of controversial. Like, people were already kind of let down by the end of season 3, and then season 4 happens, and it's very much like it gets wacky. So needless to say, they don't get together by the end of season 4. And so the fans, since this is a conspiracy, right? Where like people really believe this. Yes. There's a lot of intensity around the belief. So when they haven't gotten together by the end of season 4, the true believers, I imagine some people were like, oh, bummer. And then they stopped writing about it. But then there were...
And I think it's probably worth saying, right, like the conflict that we're talking about is not everyone who was in the Johnlock conspiracy.
No.
Not everyone.
Definitely not.
Just in case that's not clear from our description of what's happening.
Absolutely not. There are plenty. And obviously, it's like anything, there's a spectrum. Like, there were real true believers in this who could not be dissuaded. But then I'm sure there were people that were like, oh, that's a super fun idea. I love it. I'm interested in that, which honestly is kind of me. Like, I think if this had been real, I would have been truly delighted. And then there's people who are like, you know, haha, that's funny. I guess I'll follow along with that. There's a whole spectrum of people. So the people who are convinced to the point where it's, you know, it has to be true. When the show ends and they're not together, there was another series that was supposed to start airing on the BBC the week after called Apple Tree Yard, I think. If I'm wrong, I apologize. And they developed this new theory that show was actually not real. And it was like a cover by the BBC. And what was actually going to air the premiere night of Apple Tree Yard was the secret 4th episode of season 4 of Sherlock, where they were actually going to get together. Needless to say, again, that week happens, Apple Tree Yard airs, there's no secret episode, people are doubly bummed. So yeah. But now they're kind of talking about a season 5, so keep hope alive, Johnlock.
Right. And I think some people did continue to hang on to hope. So I guess we'll see what happens. Again, from the way Moftus have spoken about it, unless they've changed their tune. Maybe they've had time to...
Maybe they've changed their mind at this point.
Yeah. But if they're, you know, kind of in the same space as they seem to have been throughout the original run of Sherlock, I wouldn't hold my breath.
Yeah, it's not looking likely, I hate to say. So yeah, this leads us to kind of the whole point we wanted to do this episode, if I'm being honest.
Oh, before we get to that, I do want to say, right, so this also kind of harkens back to a couple of the theories of fan fiction that we've talked about throughout the podcast. So I mentioned earlier on, like, it's kind of interesting that season 3 and 4 themselves are the shift to a character focus, which is sort of overarchingly seems to be what a lot of fan fiction is doing. Mm-hmm. But also you have the elements of like fan fiction and fan production as a way of community building.
And this is a strong community that these folks have built,
People really got into their communities about what was happening with the show, sub-communities, and that clearly was a component. But also, I think what we really talked about was it with the Harry Potter episode of like this universe theory, where people are watching something and they love it. Mm-hmm. And then it starts not quite holding together.
Parts of it start to contradict itself.
And there is an urge to take parts of canon that don't make sense and make them make sense. And to me, that's what a lot of the Johnlock conspiracy is to look for these clues that are in the episode and say, it has to be culminating to something worthwhile. It has to be culminating to something making sense. Something beyond Sherlock has a secret sister who was never talked about before, and also his dog, it was his friend.
Yeah. Let's not talk too much about things that happen in that season. So,
right. Which I think is fair.
Yeah. Well, I do sort of love that idea of like there is a universe, like say there's a real universe where all of this is true, and this is the people writing the show are just like presenting their interpretation of what's going on in that universe, right? So parts of it can be wrong, but if two things contradict each other inside the canon, one of them has to be right. Like one of the things is actually happening in the real universe, so we need to figure out which one it is.
And I think that really leads
Yes,
us
you're right.
into
This absolutely leads
thing.
us into
Yeah.
my favorite part of this conversation. So this idea of taking a kind of sprawling canon that potentially doesn't always agree with itself and performing work to make it all make sense together is not new to the BBC's Sherlock. It has been happening in the Sherlock Holmes fandom, which is like a very old fandom in terms of
Yeah.
anything we've been talking about so far, um, since a long, long time ago. There is this thing, like a delightful, I don't know what to call it, process, activity,
Game.
pursuit. Yeah. Called the Great Game. Tell me about the Great Game.
So the Great Game, and I don't know if we'll talk about this a little bit, but I think it's interesting, right, that Sherlock is a story about finding the clues and putting everything together and making
Yeah, it
everything
makes
make
sense
sense.
that fans of it like to be their own Sherlocks.
Their own detectives.
Yeah.
So the definition of the Great or Grand Game, which we've taken from the Baker Street Wiki,
They would know.
Yes, the practice of expanding upon the original Sherlock Holmes stories by imagining a backstory, history, or other information for Holmes and Watson. It treats Holmes and Watson as real people and uses aspects of the canonical stories combined with the history of the era of the tale's composition to construct fanciful biographies of the pair. So again, fans are going back and saying, oh, in this story they said this about John, but in this story they said this about John. So what's the truth about John?
Yeah, and
and
they
how
pull
can
up
we
pieces of evidence from wherever they can find them in the canon to come up with, I mean, what is basically like the fanon, decision, but in their minds is the truth of the matter.
But the best thing about the game, and I think the most interesting thing, again, thinking about how this sort of fan activity is still perceived, right, by people outside it, is what is the origin of the Grand
The
Game?
origin of the Grand Game, in one of history's most delightful ironies, is a man who we both adore, named
Yes.
Ronald Knox. This man is a Catholic priest from God. When was he living?
It was like the early 10s. It was the
The
10s, I think.
early 10s. Let's call it that. The 1910s. I guess we should specify. So this is a man who, I mean, you should all know. After this, you'll be as delighted as we are, I'm sure. So he is around in England at the time of like Agatha Christie and all of the great detective writers. And I guess also Arthur Conan Doyle. He has many claims to fame. He was a member of what was called like the Detectives Club or something like that, which is basically like a social group for writers of detective fiction back from the glory days of detective fiction. So Agatha Christie and that whole crew had like a, social club where they would meet and talk about detective fiction. And he wrote this list of 10 commandments of detective fiction that he was delightful, and he gets known for in that group. He also, in what should be what everyone should know him for, and no one does, he was a presenter in very early days of BBC Radio. In like the second year of BBC Radio, he did one of the earliest known radio hoaxes where he pretended that Parliament was like under attack, and people, I mean, it was very clearly satire if you listen to it, but people all over the country were calling into the BBC because they were concerned that this was actually happening. And then a couple of years later, this ends up sort of inspiring Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. But relevant to this conversation, he had accidentally created the most delightful thing in the world. So he is obviously a biblical scholar. He's a Catholic priest. He's very interested in religion. At the moment that this is happening, there was some sort of new wave of biblical scholarship happening where people were reading the Bible as if it were true text, basically, and trying to come up with make all of the historical details fit in together and make sense in that way. And he thought this was kind of a ridiculous pursuit. And in order to satirize this type of biblical scholarship, he presented a theory of Sherlock Holmes scholarship that viewed all of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes works as pieces of like historical truth, and that they should be read as such, and that they could all be understood as you know, a true series of events if you were to
Yes.
read them in that way. So he is obviously, this is satire. He doesn't believe in this. He thinks it's ridiculous. But he accidentally inspires a wave of Sherlock Holmes fans who think this is a great idea. And it becomes the Great Game.
Right. And it's probably worth saying that he goes on to regret having started the Great
man's
Game.
too funny for his own good. He got in trouble for the radio hoax. People don't understand the Great Game is satire. I think Arthur Conan Doyle ends up writing him a letter that's like, basically, it's not that serious, bro. And he's like, I know, I was kidding.
Hilarious.
So this follows him for the rest of his life, that he has invented this thing that now all of a sudden it becomes like a popular thing that sort of like famous intellectuals take part in.
We say this as a way of saying that this seems endemic to a love of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
To be a detective and look for the clues and make it all make sense. And it's just an interesting phenomenon. Also, we just want to talk about Ronald Knox.
Our true goal in life is to, expand Ronald Knox's fandom. He also, by the way, wrote some detective novels, and I've read one of them, and it's pretty delightful. So, check it out, people.
I guess getting away from the Great Game and if we have to, and Ronald Knox, and sort of back to the modern Sherlock fandom. Mm-hmm. We do, of course, want to take a look at AO3, and in addition to the sort of dialogue of what's happening with the fans and the Johnlock conspiracy, what's happening in the fan fiction, right?
Yeah, that's what really matters.
The fan meta is a type of fan activity and fan work, but
and the fan meta is most of what created the Johnlock conspiracy. That's really a lot of what goes on in the fan production for this ship. But that's not to say they're slacking in writing fan fiction. To consult our AO3 ship stats, Johnlock is the second most popular ship on AO3. They have about 60,000-ish pieces of fan fiction on there. And
impressive.
It is impressive. And then our most kudos is a piece called "The Internet is Not Just for Porn." A delightful title. And funnily enough, after last time's Hannibal fic bucking the trend, we are back with our seemingly for most
fluffy
fandoms,
short.
Another fluffy, short, accessible, fun little fic. It's less than 2,000 words. It's basically the plot is everything's the same except John is like from Canada. And so Sherlock is going to all of these crime scenes and he's texting someone on his phone and giggling, and all of the other people he's working with are wondering who he's talking to, and he says, "Oh, it's my boyfriend. He lives in Canada," which I'm sure everyone has heard as a joke before. And then it turns out he's not fake. He shows up at the end.
He lives in Canada.
Cute. It is cute, right? It's Kelsey read this one because we're back on she's reading all of the fan fiction now. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say there's a lot to say about it, would you?
No, I mean, we'll post it. It's adorable. You can read it. It doesn't take very long. But yeah, I think at this point, right, it's just been interesting that Hannibal has been the only
Hannibal's the only unique fandom so far in terms of like what the most popular fic is. Because it was not just the one most popular fic. Most of the most popular fic there is multi-chapter, tens of thousands of words, not short fic.
Right. But we don't have like an instance here, right, where someone has written that non-existent extra episode.
That's true. That is interesting because it does feel like, I mean, it's over, but there have to be a lot of fans who are not happy that it's over and feel like the ending was not the ending that they deserved. So it is interesting that they haven't, I mean, I'm sure someone somewhere has written basically a whole other season to give them the ending they want, but that's not what most people are thumbs up in over on the old AO3. So I guess the last thing to talk about here is how do the fans and the creators interact? Obviously, we've gotten at little bits of this. Give me your sense of the vibe.
I would say adversarial. Probably one of the more adversarial interactions. I guess there's a couple things, right? So as we talked about with the sort of factions with the Johnlock conspiracy, you have the fans who started criticizing the authors, and then you have the fans who are trying to not criticize the authors because they think that they're going to do what they want them to do. And so that's an interesting division. But clearly, a lot of fans still pushing for it to be canon, and we saw that in the Gatiss quote you read, where he says it's not going to happen, and they transcribed.
Yeah, the crowd complains.
And unlike, again, some of the other ships we've been talking about, this is something they are asked about a lot. The actors are asked about it. The creators are asked about it. It's sort of at the forefront of the fans' demands. Now, we have those quotes from the creators, right, where they're definitely saying it's not going to happen.
Yep.
But we also have interesting things that start to get built into the show itself.
Yes. They cannot keep themselves to just quotes outside the show. They have to express themselves within the show as well. And how do they do that?
Well, I think that's interesting, too, in light of, right, the Johnlock conspiracy is being fueled by clues within the show, but there are also clues that it's not going to happen. Season 3, episode 1 is a very interesting example. When I watched it, I thought it was quite aggressive towards the fans. The way that the club that is trying to figure out how Sherlock survived is portrayed did not strike me as being particularly positive.
Right, and it's not hard to read when the writers of the show write in fans to their episodes. It's hard not to interpret that as like their opinions about their own fans, right? That's not the first time we've seen a show do that. So the way that they write Sherlock fans within the world of Sherlock is dismissive at best.
They're, in their little club and all their theories are just wacky. And the episode, I guess, ends, right, with that guy who works at Scotland Yard, whose name I can't remember. And he has his wall with all his, like, it's like a serial killer lair. Like, everything's tacked on, or like A Beautiful Mind with all the string and the red markers. And he's just freaking out and tearing things off the wall. And I'm like, what am I supposed to take from this? What are the creators trying to say?
Yeah.
The other thing that happens, like, to me, the clearest clue that the creators are not going to give you what you want is there's a bit of dialogue in season 4, episode 1, where John and Sherlock are talking about John's blog. And I think Sherlock is complaining about the titles. And John says, give the people what they want. And Sherlock says to him, no, never do that. People are stupid. And to me, I feel like that's
a little on the nose, guys.
I think that's the primary clue of what's happening in this show.
Yeah, I think that Moftis might think we're stupid. I don't know where I'm getting that idea.
So yeah, I think that's to me is really the
heart of the matter.
Yeah. What the creator's intent is.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, they're telling you. It's not like they're keeping it a secret.
So, Maddie, got a couple questions for you.
You do?
Better answer now. Is it queer baiting, queer coding, or queer canon?
What an interesting question that I've never heard before. This is pretty easy for me. I'm going to go with queer baiting. This is a pretty obvious case of queer baiting in my mind. I mean, we do have I guess we can call it a complicating factor of the fact that there's never been a time when the writers have said aloud or implied anything, queer about the characters, right? They're not playing the game of like, it's a love story the way that other people do.
It would be,
right. They say all the time they're not getting together. So there's that, but then you also have the like what they write, what happens in the show. And we're back again in a situation of like our Stucky episode where there's so much text. There's a lot of canon. There's a lot of evidence. People are not making this up out of nowhere. It's worse than that, really, because of how much in the show they talk about, like they know homo and they mention that they might be gay, but they're not gay, and people think they're gay, and it's like constant. Why are they talking about it so much if they don't want us to be thinking about it, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, I don't know if you agree with me, but what's your answer to the question?
I also say queer baiting. I don't know that I have too much to add to what you just said. I think it's been relatively clear through our discussion that we feel.
Part of the problem is like the attitudes of the writers too, right? That's part of what makes it feel kind of aggressive and not if there is such thing, well-intentioned queer baiting.
Right. Yeah. It's just stop bringing it up if
Just
it's
stop
not going
bringing
to
it
be a
up.
thing, because I wouldn't think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, people might still think about it,
Oh yeah.
but I think fewer people would think about it, because we talked about this too outside of the podcast of like, there are a million procedurals, other shows where you have two male leads who are solving crimes together, and I don't think they have this kind of activity around them, because people aren't constantly being like, you're gay, you're gay. Don't they seem gay?
Yeah.
Look at
Now,
them being kind of gay.
As I said when we were talking about this earlier, I can think of several cases of textbook queer baiting examples where people in the show say that about them. And it seems to be a common attribute of especially like procedural or whatever pairings where people keep making jokes about these two characters seeming like they're in a relationship. But it doesn't happen in, like, if you're not doing that, people can't accuse you of doing anything bad. The reason you keep getting asked about this, Moftis, is because of the way you're writing the show. You can't be like, why do people keep asking about us? We've said so many times. We've been so clear. It's not going to happen. They're asking because of the show that you write. They're watching the show and they're seeing what it says, and then they're like confused because what you're saying is not matching what you're writing.
So our follow-up question, right, is if you gender swap the characters, would they be a couple? And like, I don't even know for this one.
Me neither.
Because it's just so weird what they're doing.
Yeah, it's hard for me to tell what avenue they would go down, especially since they're so weird about the way that they talk about Sherlock in terms of his sexuality. Yeah. Like, there are times when they're saying he's doesn't care about, relationships at all. He puts it out of his head. There are times when they're like, he does care about it, but he actively avoids it. They're saying he's not asexual, but he's not this, he is that, he's not this. It like is unclear to me where they come out really on their own characterization of Sherlock.
And honestly, like, part of me just feels like if John were a woman, if he were Joan Watson.
Oh, you don't say. If anyone has seen Elementary.
Yeah, and the fans really wanted them to get together. Part of me is like, Moftis would still be dicks and be like, no, we're not going to do it.
Because of their personalities. It feels like the part of the reason, if not a majority of the reason, they don't want to put these characters together is because people want them to be together.
Right. And it's our show.
Yeah, it's not your show, it's our show. If you want a show where the guys get together, then write your own show.
You get a deal with the BBC.
Yeah, it's really easy.
Idiot. So why isn't it canon? I think we just said
the guys who write it are weird. I mean, I don't really have a hypothesis other than like they're contrary. Okay, so
that's that.
I guess let's consult the scale. On a scale from 1 to 5, how are we feeling about this queer baiting, with 5 being unrepentant, malicious queer baiting, and 1 being no idea what the fans are talking about?
It's a 5. It's 5, baby.
5. I mean, it is a different type of 5, I think, than the J.K. Rowling 5 that we gave earlier.
Sure.
Because hers was, if you consulted a textbook on queer baiting and the definition was implying a gay relationship without, like, to attract a queer audience without ever planning to go follow through on it. That is what she's doing. Like, she is saying aloud, these guys are queer, so that queer fans will want to watch, and also never intends, apparently, to get them together in canon or talk about it at all on film.
Right.
That's not what's happening here, but there is just something so, like, mean-spirited about the way that they treat the fans and treat the characters and write the show that in my mind, elevates it to a 5 as well.
Yeah. It's just so mean.
Why do they have to be so mean?
Why you gotta be so rude?
Exactly, Moftis. Well, that says what needs to be said, I guess. Let me ask my question, which I'm not hopeful for from this conversation. Feel like any better about fan fiction?
I mean, again, the fanfic I read was very cute.
Mm-hmm. You're certainly not going to be revisiting this fan fiction, are you? Sherlock fan fiction.
No, I don't. Again, I don't know that we've hit that sweet spot of like, I really want to see these two continue.
There's a lot on their journey. Stuff ahead. We have many more things to talk about. We have not hit the end of the road for you.
Right. But next week is going to be a little bit of a different episode.
You don't say. What are we talking about next week?
We're talking about what we're not going to be talking about.
That is intriguing. What could that mean?
So, we have sketched out this podcast. We have a certain number of episodes in mind of things we really have different thoughts about, but we've looked at the AO3 100 most popular ships of 2020 list, and there's a lot of stuff we're just not going to be talking about.
For
so we want to take a little step back and tell you all what you're not going to hear on this podcast.
Right, because some of them might be things that you would expect to hear about. There are a couple, I think, that are kind of pretty big queer baiting ships out there in the universe that we're not going to talk about, so we'll explain why. But then also I'm intrigued by a chance to dive into some of the like lesser known ships that we maybe just don't know enough to talk about. So if folks want to reach out, get in touch, continue the conversation, let us know if we're right, if we're wrong, if you believe in the Johnlock conspiracy. How should they reach us?
If you want to join our Ronald Knox fan club,
please join our Ronald Knox fan club. Let's start a book club of Ronald Knox books. Anybody want to join us?
Yes, let us know.
Yeah. So
by emailing us at ltbkpod@gmail.com, or tweet us or find us on Tumblr at ltbkpod.
That's Let the Boys Kiss, LTBKpod.
Yes. Started saying some different letters in there and it was going to get confusing.
Yeah. New episodes of Let the Boys Kiss are released every other Friday at 6 o'clock Eastern, basically anywhere you can get podcasts. So that'll do it for us today.
All right. I'll talk to you all next time.
Bye, bye, bye. Or no, that's in sync.
It's all good.